to welcome you all. I am pleased to welcome you all to the final session of our ongoing series, Exploring Contemporary Anti-Semitism. Over the past 5 weeks, we have learned about the various forms of anti-Semitism experienced by Jewish communities across the globe. It is clear that the anti-Semitism of 2022 greatly differs from that of a century ago. Tonight, our series concludes with Abraham Foxman, the legendary longtime director of Anti-Defamation League, ADL. As the leading authority on anti-Semitism, Foxman has observed anti-Semitism from the trenches for the past half century. In conversation with Dr. Michael Berenbaum, the two will offer a perspective on the past and the present, as well as offer directions for the future. I want to extend a special welcome to members of the Holocaust Memorial Miami Beach Zachor Society, whose support provides funding on an annual basis that ensure the continuity of the educational programs and initiatives at the Holocaust Memorial and its work throughout our community. Please welcome the world-renowned leader in the fight against anti-Semitism, bigotry, and discrimination, Abraham Foxman, who is currently the ADL's National Director Emeritus, and Dr. Michael Berenbaum, Director of the Siggy Gehring Institute and Professor of Jewish Studies at the American University in Los Angeles.
Thank you very much. This is going to be the concluding session. I could think of no better way to conclude than with a man who has literally been in the trenches for the past half century. And Abe, we again are good friends. We've been colleagues for years. So instead of calling you Mr. Foxman, I'll call you Abe, if that's all right. I won't even call you Abraham. But Abe, the first question is a question you have been asked by everybody, which is how does this contemporary situation differ from what you've observed over the past half century? What's different about today?
Well, first, it's both the same and different. It's the same because of the themes, the issues. That hasn't changed for hundreds of years. The stereotypes are the same. And remember, this week, at the end of the week, we'll be saying B'chol Dor V'Dor when we say the Haggadah. In every generation, B'chol Dor Omdim Aleinu L'Chalotenu. They stand up to try to destroy us. The Almighty saves us. So, it's a perennial. It's always been there. But you're right to ask the question, in what ways is it different? And it's different in many ways. The most dramatic, I would say, talking about the United States is we have for 100 years not had a Jew killed in this country because he was a Jew. The last time that happened was Leo Frank over 100 years ago. And so at least in America, not being immune, but being a lot different in terms of anti-Semitism. It wasn't until recently, till Pittsburgh, Poway, Jersey City, where Jews have died in this country because they are Jews. So that's a major, major difference in terms of the impact on the community, both in real terms and in psychological terms. I would say the other difference today is the advent of social media. Probably the most significant element impacting on anti-Semitism is the internet and social media. It has changed society. The internet has destroyed privacies and the way to destroy civility, but with it, it has provided a superhighway, a global superhighway for anti-Semitism, for racism, for bigotry. I would say the third element is that it's gone into mainstream. Anti-Semitism in years past was latent. It was in the sewers. People believed it, but were more hesitant to speak out. And so in recent years today, it's out there. It's out there for a lot of reasons. part of it, what I would call Trumpism. Trump did not create any of the new anti-Semitism, but by destroying all the taboos, he set up an atmosphere, almost a hechsher, legitimizing. And so, for example, the 200 neo-Nazis in Charlottesville were not created by Trump or Trumpism, but he gave them a sense that it's okay to go public, it's okay to speak out. And so what we're finding today is what some people have said, it's in mainstream, is that it's okay. You know, you can get away with it. It's legitimate. It's appropriate, etc. And I would say the fourth difference is, ironically, the state of Israel. Zionism was created with the hope and the expectations that if we make the Jewish people normal, it will do away with anti-Semitism. And ironically, it's provided a platform for anti-Semitism, a euphemistic, so I love Jews, I hate Zionists. I love Jews, I don't like Israel. And I would say to some extent, Israel has become the Jew of the nations. It used to be the Jew can only do certain things and not do other things. And so today, for example, the state of Israel, it's a normal nation, a nation amongst nations, and yet it's the only nation that cannot decide where its capital is. Other people are deciding for it. It's the only nation that when it stands up to defend itself, it has to defend its right to defend itself. So, Michael, there are others, but I think these are some of the significant changes of anti-Semitism today.
So, Abe, when you began your career, we had the idea that we could quarantine anti-Semitism, that we could keep it on the side, we could keep it mute, we could keep it impotent, and we could, as it were, push it on an off-ramp so it didn't go mainstream. How do we fight the notion today of the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism?
I think you're absolutely right. I think most of us in the field realized a long time ago that anti-Semitism is it's a presence. It was, it is, and it will be. And if after the world saw the handiworks of anti-Semitism, when the world saw what Auschwitz was and what hate did, and it didn't bring together all the scientists, all the philosophers to develop an antidote or vaccine, then we came to the realization that we will have to live with it. And as you say, we tried to develop a containment strategy, to build a firewall. And that firewall, as I said earlier, it held. It held for a long time. It is now dissipating, and for some, the reasons of the societal changes, if you destroy all that, but probably the most problematic issue is the fact that we have lost truth. Part of, what is anti-Semitism? What is bigotry? It's the lie. It's the big lie. How do you answer the lie with truth? You challenge the lie with truth. We used to have media to expose, to explain, to educate. So the challenge to rebuild that firewall is much, much greater, because if you were to say to me, what's the worst that Donald Trump did to America, is he destroyed truth. But that was for his business. But for our concerns about prejudice and anti-Semitism, the lack of truth is the loss of the most significant tool to fight in combat. And honestly, I don't know where we start. I'm sure we can bring back together coalitions, and sure there's education, and we can legislate, and we can litigate. All these things we've done in the past, we're going to have to continue doing. But the fact that we've lost the most important element in fighting the lie, which is truth, is the greatest challenge that we have. And honestly, I'm not sure I know where we begin to rebuild that. Because any containment policy, any firewall, which does not contain in it that tool of truth, will not be very effective.
Have the themes of anti-Semitism changed?
The themes,
Because you've written, I'm thinking of you in particular. You wrote a very interesting and important book on Jews and money.
That's probably the oldest stereotype of anti-Semitism. I guess I would put it back to to Christ, to the time where Jews were accused that the Jews sold out Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. And that became the basis of Western civilization's accusation that Jews are, obsessed with money. Later, it became the Jews want power in order to get money, or they want money to get power. And that expanded into Jewish control, Jewish influence. Now it's about Jews control the media, they control finance, international institutions, but it's all tied to money. And it has metastasized throughout the years. It served all kinds of masters. It serves interest. It served interest. Even to the silly but very painful thing in our country to this day. You find in schools and elementary schools and middle schools and high schools this phenomenon of throwing pennies. And where does that come from? If you want to know who's a Jew, throw a penny. Only a Jew will bend down to pick it up. We've seen it at basketball games where the Jewish team or a Jewish player, or somebody would throw a penny wanting to distract the Jewish player. It's that deep, and that it's part of a popular culture. Jewing down has become part of popular culture. But it's not just a phrase. It's very, very deep in its history, and it's alive and well today. It's the Benjamins, it's the Soros, it's also infected the political scene. And I would say, to answer to your first question, another element of change is that anti-Semitism has been politicized. It's become a political weapon that's being used by politicians for and against. I guess the only positive element of all of this is anti-Semitism is out in the open. And so, I've always been part of that school that said, when you say shush, still, don't talk about it, it won't go away. And for all these years in the ADL, Michael, we would issue reports and people would say, big deal. They would either ignore us or accuse us of trying to make things up. Today it's out there, and that's part of the mainstreaming. So part of it's public. It's, the media writes about it today because it plays into so many interests. That's the positive element. I think it's important to be out there, but it's scary when it's out there, because then people feel that it's okay. That if it's in the mainstream, you don't have to go to the sewers, you don't have to go into a club, you don't have to hide. You can do as the Charlottesville 200 did, is march in front of the cameras with their faces showing, saying, Jews will not replace us.
Let's go to the question of mainstream. One of the things that I notice in society is that American politics used to be played between the 20-yard lines. That essentially the acceptable discourse had a limit on the right and a limit on the left. And we played with most of America concentrated in the center. Could be a center right, could be a center left, but most of America was concentrated in the center. I think that in the last 10, 15 years, we've seen an expansion of the playing field, where we're playing down at the deep end, and there's a deep end on the left, a deep end on the right. And the question becomes, with those deep ends, everything's in the mainstream at this point.
Well, look, in American tradition is that the First Amendment, the Constitution, guarantees you a right to be a bigot. You can be a bigot. But what we had was a consensus, a social consensus, that while you can be a bigot, if you are a bigot, you will pay a price. There are consequences to your bigotry. Mel Gibson, not my favorite, but Mel Gibson is my best example of, here was a guy who was on top of the world, the best actor, best director, people's choice. He walked on water. And then he exposed himself as a bigot, as an anti-Semite, also as a wife beater. Didn't help, but it was the bigotry, the anti-Semitism that brought him down, and that's the beauty of America. That was in that there were consequences. And again, I go back to the Charlottesville 200. They believed before that if they stood up and showed their face in front of the cameras as anti-Semites and as bigots, maybe they'd lose their job. Maybe their kids would be ostracized. They knew there was a consequence. Now, as I said earlier, civility is gone. And with civility, all taboos are broken. When the president of the United States can say the things that he says, then anybody can say it. It's a hechsher. It's okay. And yeah, so that, listen, political correctness, which never served us. It was political correctness came in there and it covered everybody but Jews. Now you have, on the left especially, there are all kinds of concerns about minorities, about racism. We're not included. So that's another part.
There's a phrase for that, and really quite a wonderful book by a British comedian called "Jews Don't Count."
Yeah.
Which essentially says that everybody's a minority except the Jews.
Right. Well, that's what happened with political correctness when it came, and we said, "Oh, okay," we took a look around, and we weren't part of it. We were not part of the protected class group entity for all kinds of reasons. But
now let's go to that for a second. The Jews are considered by some people to be a privileged part of the white community. We consider ourselves a minority, and though we live comfortably, and the joke that Milton Himmelfarb told a half century ago is Jews earn like Episcopalians, but they vote like Puerto Ricans when Puerto Ricans voted in a specific way. So the question becomes, how are we perceived by the American people?
well,
and then we have to distinguish between how we perceived by the American mainstream and then by the American extreme right, extreme left.
Yeah. Well, that's where the good news is. If you take polls, we are one of the most respected groups in American life. And yet at the same time, the FBI reports every year that most of, that we are number one on the hit parade of religious discrimination acts against the Jews. So it's both. On one hand, there is respect and there is appreciation for who we are, what we've given the world, etc. On the other hand, it's probably jealousy. Look, a long time ago, a guy, Mark Twain, wrote an essay called Concerning the Jews. He went on a trip to Europe. He got himself in trouble financially, so he went on a speaking tour to raise money. And wherever he went, he found anti-Semitism. And he came back and he wrote an essay and he said, rich people, poor people, smart people, stupid people, religious people, atheists, wherever he went, he found anti-Semitism. Now, he came up with his own answer. We're still struggling as to why, but Mark Twain not only came up with his answer, but he also became a warrior against anti-Semitism. He spoke against it. He preached against it. He said it's jealousy. It's jealousy because Jews succeed. Well, that's very, very problematic, because if that's the reason, what's your antidote? Tell your children or grandchildren to be number 2 or number 3? That's not going to change it. But part of it is this dichotomy of success, which is, everybody wants success. So you look up to the people who succeed. On the other hand, it's the element of jealousy. And there are some who believe that the Jews, did it not by merit, not by work, not by smarts, but because, as the protocols have learned, it's conspiratorial. They're doing it behind the scenes. They only care about themselves. They can't be trusted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's both, Michael, at the same time. But sadly, the good part feeds the bad part. And the good part is that we're successful and we're smart and we accomplish and we care. That's used against us as well. And so we have to make sure that the balance is on the positive, but the positive feeds the negative. I remember when in 25, 30 years ago, there was an explosion of anti-Semitism in the United States. And we called together a group of educators, scholars, social workers, police people, and we went around the table asking why. And I'll never forget one of the social workers says, well, it's because the Jews succeed. And I remember I looked at him, I said, Archie, okay, make a deal. You know, I'll tell my kids to be number two, you're going to take care of the problem. And everybody laughed. But, you know, I tell you, after Glasnost and Perestroika, I was invited to Moscow to address a group of the city council of Moscow on the subject, why anti-Semitism. So I gave my presentation, and when I got finished, one of the guys raised his hands, Tavarish Foxman, you didn't answer the question, why? I said, well, I tried, but I said, since, you know, it's a disease of the not-Jewish mind, I'll let you answer it. He says, oh, I know why. When I was a young communist at Komsomolnik, the best Komsomolniks were Jews. When I became a member of the Communist Party, the best communists were Jews. Even now, he says, in the city council, you take a look around, and the best members of the city council are Jews. So why is there anti-Semitism? He says, because they only care about themselves. They only succeed, they only excel in order to help themselves. Well, that's one of the canards. That, you know, Jews only care about. We do care. We do. That's part of our teaching. It's part of philanthropy. But, you know, we not only care about ourselves, we care about the community, but that gets lost. Probably philanthropically, we are so disproportionate by the number of people and the amount of money that goes beyond the Jewish community. And yet, it's not really recognized. It's not really recognized.
Let's tackle the question of Israel.
Yeah.
What is your sense of, tell us your criteria in one sense, between legitimate criticism of Israel, because Israel, like everything else, is an imperfect entity, and when does it move into anti-Semitism?
Okay, you know, nobody could really improve on Natan Sharansky's analysis of it. But
by the way, I'm happy to hear that, because
okay,
every time I work through the question, I come back to Natan Sharansky's 3Ds.
Yeah, but the fact is, Michael, in terms of criticism, if you want, there's more criticism of Israel in Israel by Jews per square kilometer, per square million. You know, so it's not really a question of criticism. Yeah, absolutely. Gesunte hate. You can criticize Israel, but I want, you know, it's a question: is it only Israel that you criticize? There are a lot of, Israel's not perfect, and that's why there's self-criticism. It's part of a democracy. But what we see.
Look, one of the great, we should say, one of the great myths from the outside is the myth of Jewish unity.
Right.
And I always deal with
power and Jewish power.
Jewish power. I always deal with Jewish unity with the great joke: if you have two Jews are caught on an island, at the end of 5 years, you see 3 synagogues. One that one guy would go into, one that the other Jew would go into, and one that neither of them would set foot in. And that becomes a reality. Jewish power, by the way, you know, the great phrase that my colleague David Beal said is, Jews have never been as powerful as our enemies have thought us to be.
Or as powerful as we think we are.
And
okay, that's
well, sometimes we think we're powerful, and sometimes we think we are powerless, more powerless than we sometimes really are.
I remember the late Rabbi Moses Rosen, the chief rabbi of Romania, once on a spazier in Bucharest on Shabbos, when we walked in the middle of the street, and the tap the authorities weren't listening to us. Said to me, listen, he says, Avram Henach, he said, to be very careful with that element, because if you don't disabuse them that you have power, the first time that you don't deliver, you're in trouble. I wrote a book. One of the books that I wrote on anti-Semitism was called The Deadliest Lie, and the subtitle was The Myth of Jewish Power. And one day I gave this book to President Erdogan's political aide, and he looks at me and he says, "Hey, that's not true." I said, "What's not true?" "You have power." I said, "No, no, no. We have influence. We are good citizens. We care, and we have influence, but we don't have power." He says, "Well, what's the difference?" I said, "It's a very big difference. If Erdogan would come to the Jewish community and say, 'Listen, can you deliver this for us?' I said, and we try and we don't succeed. If you believe we have power, you'd say those dirty Jews, they didn't deliver for us. But if you understand that what we have is influence, because we use all the elements of American democracy to advocate, to lobby, to vote, to support, then you say, even if we don't succeed, thank you. But sadly, no, the belief is that we do have power, and it's a double-edged sword, because if you don't disabuse people of it and you don't deliver, then it just enhances anti-Semitism. And now, this whole element, if you really examine how many countries believe that the door to Washington is through Jerusalem. Now, on one hand, it's beautiful. Ki mitzion tetzei Torah, out of Zion will come. Okay, so wonderful. We feel proud that they come to Jerusalem because they want to. But on the other hand, it reinforces anti-Semitism. Even in this Ukrainian crisis, I'm a little so uncomfortable. Israel, look at all the criticism of what Israel isn't doing. It's a little country, but yet there is an element of this anti-Semitic concept, and Israel could make it all change. And it's a very, very double-edged sword, which we need to be careful. And I'll go back to an experience I had with the chief rabbi of Romania. He helped bring to Romania most favored nation treatment, and it was a barter deal.
By the way, there is we have to say, Moshe Rosen was one of the most intriguing characters in all of Eastern Europe.
He was the last of all the Stadlonim, of all,
the last, and really enormously skilled.
Yeah.
Enormously skilled, and the best evidence of that is twofold. I mean, there's a new book on this called Jews for Sale by Radu Ioanid, which has a whole range of things. But the best evidence of his success was twofold. Number one, that until the great Soviet migration, the Jews of Romania were the largest group in Israel. And the second is he maintained synagogues, schools, and facilities for the elderly in Romania, even as his population decreased dramatically. An enormously successful Shadlan.
And he got Ceausescu to permit Israeli teachers to come and teach the children while they were waiting to be bought out for Aliyah.
Yeah, and he used every lever of power and the illusion of power in order to go for his community.
So here's something that happened. So he got the most favored nation treatment, which, by the way, Russia just lost. You remember the struggle we had on behalf of Soviet Jewry, that the Russians, the barter was, if we, the American Jewish community, and Jackson Vanik, you remember, if we can deliver for them most favored nation treatment for trade, then they will treat the Jews, So ironically, they just lost because of the Ukraine. It was one of the things that, so here, the same thing with Romania. There was a situation during Reagan's presidency where an American minister was arrested in Bucharest for selling Bibles or giving Bibles away. And as God would have it, this minister came from Ronald Reagan's local district in California. And so when the family reached out to the White House and said, you got to do something, and the president called in his advisors and they say, how do I teach this commie whatever a lesson? They said to him, Mr. President, you have most favored nation treatment. That's something you can take away. He says, okay, take it away. The chief rabbi was summoned by Ceausescu that midnight and said, you get it back for me within 24 hours or else. I remember I got a call from the Secretary of State saying, we have a problem. And we had a problem. You know what? They released the California guy, and we got him back most favored nation treatment. But if God forbid wouldn't do that, who knows what would have been the fate of the remaining Jews in Romania.
Abe, people have been asking, they want to hear you better. Would you move a little bit closer to the microphone?
Okay.
Okay. And Lily, who asked the question, Lily, always tell us which person is not near the microphone, if I'm unhearable or Abe is unhearable, because otherwise we'll both go and sometimes we'll speak too much. Tell me, what are the good signs? If we would say the glass is half something, what's the other half?
Well,
and it may not be, by the way, it may not be half. It may be, maybe a quarter, it may be a third, it may be 20%. You've already touched on one, which is Judaism, and Jews therefore are respected.
Look, I guess it all depends on your Jewish Weltanschauung. I'm an optimist, so I've always seen the glass more full than more empty, than less empty. So look what we have survived. How can Golda Meir once said, Jews don't have the luxury to be pessimists. It's a little bit aside, but I guess it explains. I'm trying to explain why I feel this sense of optimism. A couple of years ago, I was invited to the Y Plantation to spend 3 days discussing whether Jews will survive as a civilization in the year 2050. Okay, so we sat around the Y Plantation pontificating about history. But what the organizers did is they had some scholars study the historians of history, the Spenglers, the Toynbees, to see if they can distill what it was that destroyed the Roman civilization, the Greek civilization, the Inca civilization. Why is it that these great empires, civilizations perished and the Jews are still here? And then the question is, if we can distill what it was, that secret, if you will, of Jewish survival, then we can answer the question, will Jews, survive?
By the way, the Dalai Lama is fascinated precisely with that question.
Okay, so I have an answer.
In other words, he's trying to create a community that can live in exile. And he's fascinated with that question. And after you give me your answer, I'm gonna play with that question as well.
Okay, so the answer that we came up with was the secret of Jewish success is basically that after every tragedy, so the Romans had a defeat, and when the Roman Empire fell, nobody got up the next day and said, oh, I want to be a Roman. I want to be a Roman. Help me be a Roman. When the Greeks fell, the empire fell, the Greeks didn't get up there and say, I want to be a Greek. With the Incas, we really don't know. There's no history, we don't know, but certainly Incas didn't go jumping up and say, I want to be. With Jews, after every tragedy, the destruction of the first temple, the second temple, the exiles, the expulsions, and horror of horrors, the Shoah, if after that the Jews came back, dusted themselves off, stood up and said, I want to continue to be being a Jew. Listen, I challenged my father, Oliver Shalom, after the Shoah. We survived the Shoah and we lost 90% of our family. And I said to my father, Tatan, why are you teaching me faith and to want to continue to? And you know what? That's the secret of Jewish survival. And that's the positive element, that even in the worst of times, there is a value, there is a purpose, there is a mission, there is a pride. And wow, you know what? That's why we're still here.
And the other element about it, Abe, is we reinvented ourselves in new ways of being Jewish. In other words, I thought we lost a couple of weeks ago, we lost Madeleine Albright.
Yep. Now,
Madeleine Albright was a colleague of mine at Georgetown. I joked that I knew Madeleine Albright before she was Madeleine Albright. I knew her as a college professor at Georgetown. She described her family, and she said they were Czechoslovakian patriots and social democrats. And I, with my knowledge of history, said that meant they were Jews, because someone was a Czech patriot or a Slovak patriot, and social democracy and the nationalism that was Czechoslovakian was Jewish. Now, why didn't she identify it? Because in her family, in her parents, not her family, because some of her family were Jewish, she had Jewish cousins. In her family, Jewishness became the third rail of family history. Don't go near there. And they used the opportunity to assimilate to put that completely behind them. But you know yourself that the largest, and this is really miraculous, the highest birth rate in all of post-war Europe was in the displaced persons camps. And I once interviewed a man from Boston by the name of Rabbi Arnold Weider. Arnold Weider was a mole, a ritual circumciser, and because he was from Boston and their great love of the Yankees, they used to nickname him the Yankee Clipper. So I said, where did you learn to be a mole? He said, I learned to be a mole from my father in Bergen-Belsen, where we circumcised the boys who were born, and we circumcised the boys who during the war years were not circumcised. And I said to myself, it's unbelievable that somebody who did not know what the world was going to be and where they were going to live, and who for 6 years, if they lowered their trousers, were dead, would in the 7th year immediately make an indelible mark on it. And look what we reinvented ourselves. We reinvented ourselves in Israel. And during our history, American Jewry came of age. Yep. It really came of age. And instead of disappearing, we came back with a ferocity. Let's take a couple of questions. We got some response to the issue of Donald Trump and anti-Semitism by saying, but Trump was good to Israel. He moved the embassy to Jerusalem, and he got the Abraham Accords. And the Abraham Accords, this is me now, not the question. The Abraham Accords have the potential of diminishing Muslim anti-Semitism over the long run, once the elites tell the people Israel is not the source of all evil. Your response, Abe?
So I always try to tell the Jews that we have to learn to walk and chew gum at the same time. We should be able to say, Mr. Trump, thank you for Jerusalem, and thank you for the Abraham Accords, but no thank you for the immigration, the racism, the bigotry that you have legitimized. We should be able to say both, and one doesn't obviate the other. So, you know what? Thank you, but no thank you. The political atmosphere, to me, the greatest harm that Trump did is to destroy, as I said, truth. So Jerusalem, you recognize it, that's wonderful. But I should be able to say, thank you, Mr. President, but you have destroyed civility. You have legitimized elements of uncivility in this country. You have so exacerbated our political system that democracy is in danger. And what Jews need is democracy. If you want to, take a look of where Jews survived and where they made it. So during the campaign, all my life I tried to walk the middle. All my life I was to the right, I was left, to the left, I was right, and I knew that I was doing the right thing. But
when both attacked you, you certainly were doing the right things.
And for the first time in my 50 years after I finished with I wrote an op-ed which said, Mr. Trump is a danger to democracy. And if he's a danger to democracy, he's a danger to Jews. And so, again, we should be able to carry water on both sides. And so, yes, thank you. And yet we are now paying the price of lack of civility, lack of respect, no truth, destroying media, questioning our democratic process. That's not good for Jews. It's not good for America. Certainly is not good for Jews.
Let me reinforce that by saying that the more stable a society is, the better the situation of the Jews. And that is, instability leads to hatreds, and hatreds leads to the deep expression of anti-Semitism. What are your worries about one of the other questions, what are your worries about anti-Semitism from the left?
I worry about anti-Semitism on the left, and I worry about anti-Semitism on the right. Listen, Nazism killed Jews and communism killed Jews. I worry about it because the left has become now illiberal, and therefore not only are Jews excluded, not only do they have a blind eye to anti-Semitism, where in the progressive world, Jews are not included as part of the people that they care about and they care for, and Israel is an issue for them, which leads some of them to be anti-Israel in the sense of not giving Israel the right to be a legitimate state, and that's from the left, and that troubles me, because at the end of the day, Israel to the Jewish people is the ultimate insurance policy. Yes, America is wonderful. Yes, America is special. America is unique, but we're not immune. And therefore, anybody out there who undermines the right of the Jewish people to have the same right as any other nation for self-determination, self-expression, and sovereignty is an enemy, not of Israel, but of the Jewish people. And sadly, the left is out there much more vociferously challenging and questioning Israel's right to defend itself, Israel's right to bear arms, etc. And so, yeah, I worry about it, but we should worry about it.
And let's also say that the incredible thing at this point is that the vehemence of the opposition to Israel is enormously, it makes a very, very loud noise, even though the effectiveness of the opposition to Israel is not visible.
Right.
In other words, we haven't seen real consequences, even from BDS, in terms of economic consequences. But
BDS is a failure. I remember having a meeting with the prime minister, and he says, "Okay, BDS." He says, "I don't have time to go to the bathroom. All these countries are lining up. They want to do business with us. They want to do deals with us. They want to be partners with us." So yeah, and ironically, it backfired because of the Abraham Accords. But as you say, the noise it makes, the propaganda, is out there very high. It has had no success except in the propaganda field. And that's important because people are not as smart as we would like them to be, not as knowledgeable as we'd like them to be. And it's all sound bites, especially on the internet. And that in the future could hurt Israel.
Let's also say one of the best examples of Israel as an insurance policy is something quite remarkable, which is there's been a dramatic uptick in Aliyah from Russia. That the Russian Jews have come to the conclusion that there's going to be instability in Russia over a significant period of time, that it's going to be problematic, and therefore they are the ones, almost more than the Ukrainians, who are moving to Israel. And that's a surprising example of the insurance policy.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether you want to put it in the same category. This last year has been the greatest number of Aliyah of Americans to Israel. and probably if we look at France and England. So, that's both the good news and the bad news. The more Jews feel insecure, Israel becomes more the place of security, despite the fact that in the streets of Tel Aviv and Beersheba and Hadera, there isn't security. But in the long run, this is the place, this is the insurance. Yeah.
And also despite the fact that some Israelis perceive a great existential threat from Iran with nuclear capacity.
Well, if you were to ask me what keeps me up at night, I would say it's the existential threat from Iran. And I don't have the same sense of a feeling that the good people of the world will stand up. They're not standing up. So maybe Ukraine from that perspective is a positive surprise. And I think probably that's where Mr. Putin so miscalculated. He believed that the West is out and finished. He believed some of the whispers he got from some of his friends. I think that's it's very tragic. It's very painful. But on the other hand, what we see is the world coming together for the first time in a long time to stand for democracy, freedom, and independence. That's.
And then the other thing with understanding that the great hero of the Ukraine is a Jew.
Yeah. Irony of all ironies, right?
The irony of all ironies is that the great hero of the Ukraine is a Jew, and the accusation against him is that he's running a Nazi government, which ended up being, ironically, again, everybody has to reach for the Holocaust as a metaphor because of its power as a symbol of negativity, the negative absolute. But that's where Putin looked preposterous in that accusation.
You more than anybody understand how difficult it is for us to stand up and say, I am a Ukrainian. I've stood up in recent weeks and publicly declared I am a Ukrainian. And yet for you more than anybody that I know how difficult it is.
Let me take a minute just to give the history. The Ukrainians were the staff of Treblinka and Belzhytz. Belzhytz had a staff of 104, 14 of whom were Germans, 90 were Ukrainians. Treblinka had a staff of 120, of whom 30 were Germans, and 90 were Ukrainians. The people who backed up the German troops in the Warsaw Ghetto were Ukrainians. Ukrainians were, in many respects, perpetrators during the Holocaust, and they were lured by the promise of nationalism that they would get an independent state from the Germans. So the idea that Putin miscalculated because he imagined for a moment that the Ukrainians would want to join Mother Russia. And in the 1930s, Mother Russia was responsible, Stalin in particular, for the Holodomor, which is now regarded as a genocide, in which somewhere between 2 and 6 or 7 million Ukrainians were killed. So to say I am a Ukrainian doesn't sit well in my historical consciousness, but in this current thing, you have to ask the question: where are we? And here we are, in which Ukraine represents the West, democracy, tolerance, pluralism, and freedom, and that's quite something. We have two questions regarding the situation with the United States and Iran. Let me just answer two questions that have come in. The name of the famine was called the Holodomor, Holodomor, and that was the famine in which the Ukrainians were killed. It is absolutely deep in the Ukrainian consciousness, I would say almost as deep in the Ukrainian consciousness as anything in that. And the other book that you've asked for is Jews Don't Count, which is again said in humor, but a very, very serious book. We've asked a couple of things. Is the current U.S. administration helping Iran, as did an earlier administration, just setting the stage for the next war?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. You know what? Very frequently, the Arabs have helped, and hopefully here too, because of their excessive demands, this thing will go nowhere. I, I listen, at the beginning of time in the Iran deal, America did it because it felt that it was in the best interest of the United States. It wasn't doing it for Israel or against Israel. And we need to recognize that that's what American policy is about. Sometimes American policy's decisions are helpful and supportive, and sometimes they're neutral, and sometimes they're negative. I'm old enough to remember the sale of AWACS to Saudi Arabia, the tragedy that it was. I think probably today most American Jews would support sale of all kinds of arms to Saudi Arabia. So yeah, I think it's motivated by, I think it's wrong. I think some of the decision making is wrong, but it's not motivated against Israel. It's what our leadership in the last 10 years believed is in the best interest of the United States and the best interest of peace and stability. I think they're wrong. And hopefully the Iranians will help us by such demands that nothing will happen. But that doesn't, so if there's no deal, the problem is not solved. And that is, we're still questioning, I know the Prime Minister of Israel urged President Trump to withdraw. Okay, and then what? Withdrawing, I guess, made sense, but it didn't make sense if there was no plan B. There's still no plan B. So, okay, I know how we all feel that this is the wrong deal, but then what? I don't, where is the thinking? Because to me, that's the existentialist threat to Israel. Terror hurts, it kills people, it's tragic, but it doesn't threaten the existence of Israel. Iran can threaten because they are a theological, irrational, authoritarian entity that has the ability to do terrible things. So, okay, so
let me interrupt by only saying one thing, which is a minor solace to the Jewish community. But it's if you think of a very interesting thing, if you ask who has the greater capacity to inflict damage on which society, and then you'd have to say, for the first time in history, the Iranians would have to be more worried about Israel's capacity than Israel has to be concerned about Iran's capacity.
If they're rational.
Now, that we're talking about capacity. The second half of it is that you have a terrible problem, which is that the presumption in nuclear war was that mutual assured destruction would impose sanity on both sides. And thus far it has worked. But the problem is, how insane is this regime? And secondly, how theologically committed are they to another life in which they are willing to endanger their own people? But the one solace that comes to me from history is look at the capacity now of Israel, and also look at the fact that many in the Arab world prefer Israel with a bomb than they do with Iran with a bomb, which is an incredible perception, an incredible sense of rationality, responsibility, all of these things, because they don't expect that from the other side.
And while Trump deserves the credit for the Abraham Accords, ironically, so does Iran, because it was, as you indicated, the fear of Iran that brought those countries much closer to Israel. And even though Saudi Arabia doesn't have a public relationship, there are a lot of military, intelligence, and other relationships now today, because the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
The enemy of my enemy is my ally.
My ally.
The enemy,
my
the
friend.
enemy of
And become a friend, right?
the enemy of my enemy is my ally. I have not asked you one question because I don't think we can ask you that question, but I want to acknowledge it because I know the person who asked it, which is asking you to criticize the organization you used to work for. So I want to say it that I'm saying that I'm not asking you that question because that's an unfair position to put you in, and I think that we shouldn't demand that. Abe, what's your sense of in your mind? Is there any way now to put the guardrails back in, to push for civility and for truth?
We have no.
And how the hell do we do that?
We have no other option. We must put the guardrails back. We must bring civility back. I think we are struggling with social media and the internet. Listen, after 9/11, we struggled with balancing our freedoms and civil liberties and life. And we found some balances. We gave up certain freedoms after 9/11. With the Patriot Act, et cetera, we haven't resolved it. I think we're now into what I think is even a bigger struggle, and that is, how do we balance civility with freedom of speech? We didn't talk about something which a cancel culture. I spent my whole life trying to change people's minds and hearts, not trying to cancel them. And yet that's part of the incivility out there. So we have no choice but to find this balance between a consensus of what is a civil society and freedom of speech. And that is so exacerbated by the internet that's our major challenge. Hopefully with that will come the bringing back of truth, respect for media and journalism. We need that too. We used to use media to expose, to educate. It's gone. If it's fake, then, who cares? Yeah, I think we have no choice but to start to bring back that consensus of what makes us a civil society.
Okay. Abe, once again, I think it's enlightening. You always have much to say. You always have much to teach. And I, for one, have been grateful not only for your career, but for the values for which you have stood during your entire time of service to the Jewish people. Ladies and gentlemen, we've had a very interesting series. I hope that you've appreciated it. I know that on my end, I have found it fascinating and interesting, and I thank you for your attention. I'm going to turn it back to Nikki now, and we'll sign off. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Berenbaum, and thank you, Mr. Foxman.